All right, thank you everybody, and thank you all for sticking around through the afternoon. I hope you all got some sugar or some coffee, pick me up, because now we are going to talk about data quality. And this theme has come up a few times already today, and so now I want to talk about some real evidence related to data quality. So there are several major data quality issues that come up in citizen science. The first is observational error, which includes species misidentification as well as measurement error, using a measuring instrument improperly or reading the wrong number. There's also the potential for spatial and temporal bias in crowdsourced projects. You heard a lot about some of the birding crowdsourcing projects that go on. So those kind of projects involve sometimes volunteers submitting data on their own time and from anywhere. In those kinds of projects, there can be bias towards, say, popular hiking trails or towards data collection on weekends. The third issue is lack of metadata. So information about the projects, about the volunteers, about their training, which is helpful to view the volunteer data sets in context and really try to compare across programs. So I'm mainly today going to be talking, though, about observation error. Just are people recording the right thing? But what is error in the first place? I'm going to be revisiting this question in a few slides. But to start, most of what's usually meant by error in these studies or papers about accuracy is comparing volunteer data to expert data, as if we so-called experts are infallible, which is not the case. But we'll revisit that. We'll revisit that in a few slides. So what does the existing literature tell us about volunteer data quality, particularly in the ecological and environmental sciences, where volunteers are mostly collecting field data? So I'm going to briefly explain findings from half a dozen prior studies on volunteer error here to show the huge ranges that have been found with accuracy levels. In a study of birds, volunteers were tested online for their proficiency with identifying bird calls. And the conclusion was that common species were more accurate and that volunteers with higher skill level were more accurate in general. However, those volunteers with the higher skill level also had higher rates of false detections for the rare species. So they were hearing those uncommon species when they weren't really there. In another example, invasive plant species were flagged for a species identification test along a trail, and professionals were compared against volunteers, which is interesting because that kind of comparison is not really done very often. It's usually volunteers versus professionals, but in this case it was volunteers and professionals together against what was deemed to be the true identification of these plants. So the professionals had 88% accuracy and the volunteers 72% at species ID, and the volunteers were better at species that were deemed easier to identify. And also volunteer self-reported comfort level was correlated with higher accuracy, so those that said they were more comfortable with species identification. The next example is about bee species ID, and in this case, volunteers and researchers were doing bee ID along transects. But it's important to note that bees move around a lot. So the bees observed by one field crew, the volunteers might not have physically still been there when the researchers came along. But nonetheless, there was supposed to be some decent level of agreement if everyone knew how to identify bees. But the authors found that volunteers missed about half the species. And the authors still concluded that citizen science had great potential for bee conservation work, but they said that it should really be used for broader classes of bees, so family or genus level, not necessarily species level. So talking about appropriate use of that volunteer data. The next example is about crabs. Volunteers sat on the beach doing species ID and sex ID for just a few species of crabs, and this involved volunteers of varying levels of education and ages. Then researchers were double checking these crabs as they were piled into bins, I think. So volunteers with at least 2 years of college education had 95% accuracy rates, whereas volunteers with middle school or high school education had 80 to 95% accuracy. So finally getting to trees. But part of what we're seeing here with these different studies I'm reviewing, and even these tree studies, is remarkably different results and implications based on the particular characteristics of the project. For bees, volunteers had a lot of challenges, but for crabs, they did fairly well. And this might be caused, it's not entirely clear yet, might be caused by differing levels of task complexity. There were far fewer species of crab to identify compared to bee species. or maybe there's different kinds of volunteers involved, or there are different prior levels of skill and training. So keep all that in mind when we talk about trees, where we have huge diversities of species that we're asking volunteers to identify. But at the same time, we don't have the challenges of our organisms moving around like you have in studies of insects and birds. So in the tropics, this first bullet point here, plot data was collected by community members and compared to professional foresters. And the conclusion was that the community member data on species, tree counts, and diameters all led to similar biomass estimates. So that was very promising. And then up until recently, the only study of volunteer accuracy in urban forestry was from 1996, this study by Bologniars and Ryan, and it compared volunteers to arborists, so deeming the arborist data to be the true value. And the volunteers had 91 to 95% consistency with genus and less with species. So as I said earlier, the complexity of the species ID task for these tree projects is arguably harder than asking volunteers on a beach to ID just like half a dozen species of crabs. And so it's important to recognize that some of our cities have over 100 species. There may not be a single guide. New York has now developed this very comprehensive street tree guide for their city that some of our other northeastern cities can borrow, but it's not something as a resource for the volunteers that is terribly well developed at this point. And also more broadly across these different citizen science projects, different kinds of organisms and study systems, there hasn't yet been a systematic review of data quality in citizen science to try to understand broader patterns across these different studies. And I came at this as someone, as Sarah mentioned, who's somewhat newer to citizen science, but I kept hearing from other researchers, folks truly within my agency or across universities going, oh, citizen science, that's a nice idea, but meh, the data quality. You know, is this just glorified outreach? Is it really leading to science? And I would say, oh, the birders, they're doing it so well. But how can we really unpack the different literature to understand truly how decent is this data? What does data quality truly mean for using the data productively for our different intended uses? So that brings me to the literature review that I have underway with some colleagues, including a few in this room, Rebecca Jordan, Susanna Lehrman, and some others. And the scope of this review is to find papers about observational or measurement error from the ecological and environmental sciences, so field data. So far, we have 43 articles summarized in a giant table, and by the time this is done, we might have 100 articles. And I have to give a shout out to interns V. Nguyen, who isn't with us anymore but got this started, and Thomas Amolo, who helped summarize many of these articles. You all met Thomas when you were at the registration table. And the goals of this literature review are to assess the extent and predictors of error across many studies, figure out how the project characteristics relate to that error, and then really evaluate appropriate uses of citizen science given the documented data quality issues and the conclusions that these different authors have drawn across different study systems. In the next couple slides, I'll give an overview of the kinds of studies we have accumulated so far. Most have been about animals, including insects, birds, and other animals. A smaller percentage about plants, really only 2 or 3 about trees. The other category includes some water quality stuff, and we're going to be really ramping up the numbers of articles about water quality in the next couple months. And I classified how the volunteers operated into 2 basic themes, expedition or crowdsourced. So crowdsourced, again, are projects where you can submit data more or less anytime, anywhere. Expedition-based projects, I borrow this term expedition from Earthwatch, for any of you who are familiar with Earthwatch's work. What I mean by this is you're going out in a tree mapping party in urban forestry, you're going out on a specific day with some kind of supervisory structure. So then what was the purpose of these different projects? How did the authors of these different papers frame the work? How did they talk about the intended use of the data? So a little over half was research-based data collection, a little under half was resource management, and then a smaller fraction regulatory. And again, as we ramp up the number of articles that relate to water quality, it seems that a lot of the regulatory-based volunteer monitoring comes out of the water quality world. So then what is error? We looked at how these different studies defined error in the first place. It was not always explicit, but whether there was an implicit meaning or an explicit definition, the vast majority of studies said that error means volunteer data is not consistent with expert data. And this definition can be a little troubling because it acts as if the expert data represents the true value. It assumes that we so-called experts are infallible, that if myself and Jason Henning, who I've worked with collecting data before, if we as people with PhDs in forest ecology were to go out and collect data, we would agree 100% of the time. That's just not true. There's going to be variation among your field collectors at any level of expertise and prior training. So I wanted to offer today a more generalized definition of observation error. And this comes from Wikipedia, which is not necessarily where we're supposed to cite things in scholarly presentations, but I thought if anyone could appreciate the value of crowdsourced information, it might be this crowd. So the definition is observational error or measurement error is the difference between a measured value of a quantity and its true value. In statistics, an error is not a mistake. Variability is an inherent part of things being measured and the measurement process. So while sometimes measurement error in this kind of a definition or other kinds of places I've been looking to find more kind of textbook definitions of error, they're sometimes discussed with respect to lab equipment and other kind of forms of technology and measuring devices. It's important to keep in mind that for field work, for the kind of work we do in urban forestry and that's done in other parts of ecology, our field crews are our measurement instruments. And there's inherent variability among those field crews as our measurement tools in collecting data. And that's true whether those field crews, those measurement devices, are paid or unpaid, whether they are trained or untrained. So now moving on to a study of data quality in urban forestry specifically. The study that I'm about to share with you is a pilot test of urban tree monitoring protocols that were developed collaboratively by researchers, professionals, and students in urban forestry. And this grew out of the Urban Tree Growth and Longevity Working Group, which is an affiliate of the International Society of Arboriculture. For anyone who's interested in seeing the working draft of these protocols or joining that network, here's the website, and here's a screenshot of the front page of those protocols. And I'm working with some colleagues to finally publish this field guide and a companion piece resource guide as Forest Service technical reports. So stay tuned for that, probably in 2017. But in the meantime, the working draft is online and ready to use. So we created a minimum data set of variables that are essential to any long-term monitoring project. We weren't reinventing the wheel when it comes to tree inventories, but rather paying extra attention to issues of training and to issues of long-term integrity of the data, especially locational accuracy, and things like repeated measurements of tree diameter, breast height, or DBH. And the goal of this pilot test of this field guide, the goal of the pilot test was to use our method that we had developed, again, not reinventing the wheel, but to use this particular training document to evaluate observation error from field crews of varying experience levels, and then to revise the protocols based on the results and make recommendations about how to use volunteer data in urban forestry. And the paper on this is almost ready to go to a journal for publication. But for any of you who would find direct application of this, please go ahead and write me and I'll be happy to send you the as-submitted version of the manuscript. So I'll be sharing results from 4 cities, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Lombard, Illinois, Philly, and Malmo, Sweden. And Jess Sanders from Casey Trees in DC also helped us collect data. I'm just going to be presenting on these 4 cities here. So these were folks that were involved in that Urban Tree Growth and Longevity Working Group that just volunteered themselves to help out with this pilot test. What we did in each city was have crews record 150 street trees in a pre-selected neighborhood with 7 crews all independently observing the same trees, so they weren't talking to each other and helping out. They were all operating as if completely independent from each other. And there was one expert whose data was considered correct, with the important caveat that I acknowledge the experts are not perfect. And then 3 novice crews and 3 intermediate crews all paired up within that skill level. The intermediates had some prior experience with essential skills like tree ID and measuring trees, whereas the novices had little to no prior experience. And I have to give a shout out to Dan Betts from Rutgers, who was given a shout out from Rebecca earlier as well. He helped run the Philadelphia site for this project. So here are the variables included in this study in the minimum data set. For location, it's getting an accurate location of that tree, also the site type and land use affiliated with that planting site along the sidewalk. For tree data, species, trunk diameter, which is diameter at breast height, or DBH. mortality status, and then dieback and transparency of the crown, as well as wood condition. So as most of you probably already know, trunk diameter at 4.5 feet is DBH. But there are many special considerations. And while it's not rocket science, there are so many strange little rules about how you're supposed to record DBH that it can get quite confusing for newbies to this process. And what we wanted to do to, again, ensure that the data quality would be high, or hopefully ensure the data quality be high and enable more robust remeasurements, we created a kind of cheat sheet on best practices for DBH measurement. So I mentioned earlier that this field guide is online. Even if you don't want to borrow anything else from our field guide, you might find this one page useful. It's basically a distillation of those who have taught forest ecology and dendrology before, a distillation of all of the ways in which they would catch their students making mistakes. So we call it best practices, but it's really how not to screw up DBH. So things like the D-tape, for any of you who've used it before, it has a side that's for circumference and a side that's for diameter. Use the correct side. Make sure the DBH tape is perpendicular to the trunk. That was our way of saying make sure you compensate for the lean of the trunk. Make sure the D-tape is pulled snug, right? You don't want it too loose. You don't want the tape to be flipped. Another common mistake when using D-tape is reading the numbers in the reverse order, and we tried to explain this with that bottom illustration. So sometimes when reading D-tape, folks will write down 5.8 when it's really 4.2, reading the D-tape backwards. So these kind of very practical things about how to actually use your measurement device, we tried to give a one-page tip about and also address very purposefully during training. So speaking of training, all of these crews received a 6 to 7 hour training. Sometimes it was over 2 nights. And we broke down, just for this audience, I thought you might appreciate how long we spent on different components. So 1.5 hours total on species ID, 1 hour total on DBH. And then we all practiced outside together for an hour. And finally, spent about half an hour discussing error sources. So this involved having the crews write down ideas on Post-it notes. I'm kind of a fan of writing things on Post-it notes, you've noticed. And so the crews would write down how the error might be introduced into their data collection, and we all put them up on the wall and then kind of collaboratively brainstormed how to prevent those problems from happening or how to fix them after they happened. And we didn't directly test, does a lack of this exercise lead to more problems, but it seemed that I could see little light bulbs going off in some people's heads while we were doing this. So, getting to the results. These next several slides are going to show you the average across all field crews in all cities, and there were remarkably similar results across the novice and intermediate crews, so I didn't break them out here. When we went into this project, we thought we would potentially be seeing differences between novices and intermediates, and amazingly, their results were pretty similar. So the protocols took only 3 minutes per tree. There were sometimes issues with tree counts, with participants not always agreeing with experts as to how many trees were actually in that predefined several blocks of a neighborhood. There was about 1% extra trees and about 1% missing trees. Different kind of circumstances that led to each that we tried to document for each city. So for example, some crews in Lombard just completely missed a whole block of trees, but in other circumstances it was field crews that seemed to, we're not entirely sure, maybe they were operating too fast, they got distracted by a pedestrian, but it was just one tree in the middle of the block that they missed. So this is important to know that if using volunteers for an inventory, be aware that the count could be off by a little bit. For site type and land use, both were around 90% consistent with what the experts reported. Then for mortality status, and as Sarah said, I'm a little bit obsessed with mortality status, so I want to unpack this one a little more. When the experts said that the tree was dead, there was 100% agreement on that. When the experts said the tree was alive, there was 99.8% agreement, so very promising, but there were some trees that were nearly dead, right? So they weren't quite all dead. We had a very strict definition of dead tree. It had to have no green leaves, no live buds. And so there were some volunteers that called these trees dead when they weren't quite dead yet. Now the truth is we actually didn't have very many dead trees, so this level of agreement looks very high because there weren't that many trees that were extremely unhealthy or that were standing dead. So for programs that would like to use volunteers or already are using volunteers for survival monitoring, it would be worth checking across a landscape that has more trees that are dead to see how the rates of accuracy compare. And then for dieback, the consistency with experts was 92%, for transparency 72%, and wood condition 55%. So based on these results, the co-authors, the collaborators, and I are recommending not using transparency and wood condition. That's, again, why this was a pilot test. And municipal arborists often have concern with using volunteer-generated wood condition anyway, so this is kind of a further way of justifying some of that concern when it comes to evaluating structural stability of trees. So in terms of species identification, which is a big issue for many of us in urban forestry, whether on the research or management side, the agreement with the expert for genus was 91% across all the crews, and then for species it was 85%, and that's within correct genus. And so 91% is certainly shy of 100%, but I think it's kind of amazingly promising. Like I said earlier, the novices and the intermediates both had around the same rates, and so to think that folks with only an hour and a half of classroom training on species ID and a little bit of practice could get genus right 90% of the time, that's pretty promising. So in terms of diameter, DBH, so there was a disagreement on stem count. So how many stems does this individual tree actually have? We have, as I think you all know, many multi-stem trees in cities, and so we followed multi-stem DBH methods that come out of the Forest Inventory and Analysis Protocol, FIA, out of the Forest Service. We have decided that that is too complicated for volunteers and frankly even for interns, but this often happened with trees that experts were deciding to record just as one stem or two stems, and the volunteers were recording more stems. So then the DBH agreements on the actual measurements below are just for trees that everyone agreed was single stem. So the trees were measured to the nearest 10th inch, and there was an exact agreement 20% of the time. Within a 0.1% tolerance of the expert level, that was 54% of the time, and within a 1-inch tolerance, that was 93% of the time. So this is very promising, especially for management applications where a 1% tolerance is fine for many direct management applications. However, I should point out there was a systemic bias. It was small, but it was there. The participant DBH was a little over 1/10 of an inch higher than the expert on average. So some conclusions from this pilot test. To reiterate again, it was pretty remarkable that the novices were as good as the intermediates most of the time. And how should citizen science data be used in urban forestry going forward, considering some of these, what are the intents of the data kind of issues? Survival monitoring seems very promising, but as I said earlier, it'd be worth checking on a system that had more dead trees. Again, would not recommend using transparency and wood condition collected by volunteers. And DBH is fairly good within 1 inch, but it's important to consider revising multi-stem methods. In the revised version of these protocols, the one that's actually up on the web right now, my colleagues and I have started to recommend that for multi-stem species, rather than following the protocols out of FIA, Forest Inventory Analysis, or the protocols out of iTree, instead go down. So think of it this way: for trees that branch a lot, around 4 or 5 feet, so your Zelkovas and your flowering cherries and your flowering pears, instead of trying to measure a whole bunch of stems around here, go lower where there's just one stem, and then it's more consistent for everybody. And the first time I proposed this, it felt very radical. It's like, this is not the way that protocols have been designed so far, but when you think back to where did DBH come from, it came from white male foresters measuring around the height of their chest to get board feet. And if that's not the application that you have in mind for your data, then consider something new. So with consistency in mind, consistency across space and consistency across time, and thinking of what makes sense for these growth forms that are not the kind of growth forms encountered when the DBH kind of standards were developed, I would say, and some of my colleagues, we've all discussed this, would agree, measure low, so you're all more consistent measuring just one stem. And last, on species ID, it would seem that species ID, again, is promising considering how little species ID training many of these volunteers had, but it's pretty evident to me that we could use some better resources, potentially some photo validation. That's not something that's designed into the apps we have available today, but it would seem that to really move forward with relying on these species for research or for management, that we could borrow some of the techniques, perhaps even some of the technology from other sectors of citizen science that use trained botanists, or again, folks that know species ID, to look at volunteer recorded photos. That some of that could be done offline, or rather off-site afterwards. It would require quite a bit of investment in getting the right technology though. So moving forward, wrapping up. So next steps with data quality in urban forestry, or really any other discipline that's interested in citizen science, they involve connecting the dots between volunteer skill level, who are these folks that have come out to give their time to collect data, volunteer training and resources, and task complexity. Just how hard is the job that you're asking volunteers to do? And then connecting all of that with data quality necessary for intended uses, deciding what is acceptable error. How close does deviation need to be to this magical true value in order for it to be usable for your particular project? And thinking broader about implications of data quality studies, they can be used to revise study design and training, which is part of how we use the pilot test here. They can be used to get quantified rates of error to put into uncertainty in larger models. So being able to say, even if you're just reporting the overall outcomes of an urban tree inventory, say, here's our count of trees, plus or minus 1%. That kind of very simple thing in a reporting summary or in a broader model of ecosystem services, for example, is very relevant to using this kind of quality assurance data. And last, we can use this kind of literature review I described earlier to try to help inform these efforts towards data and metadata standards to see what kinds of things citizen science projects are already reporting about their project characteristics and their volunteers, and try to help enable cross-study comparisons. Just want to let you go. Ooh. All right, I'm apparently stuck on this slide. Oh, there we go. And so there was a review actually put forth a few years back by Andrea Wiggins, who I think someone else mentioned, about data quality mechanisms in citizen science. So what kind of data quality mechanisms are already in place across different types of projects, and those include expert review, photo submission, having the paper data sheets submitted alongside online data entry, having replication by different participants, and so on. And it's important to think about which of these kinds of mechanisms could we put in place in urban forestry, which kinds of mechanisms do maybe some of our projects in this room already have in place, and what else could we do moving forward to really make sure that we're trying to promote higher data quality, and also just that we're documenting that data quality, whatever it happens to be. And last but not least, a final take-home message that I think would concur with what some of our morning speakers said. Citizen science is just another form of science. And I could have put capital S, science. All of these things that I described here are what colleagues in forest ecology do with their paid interns, right? The data collection going on for other kinds of scientific research involves all of these steps. The field crews just happen to often be paid in so-called professionalized crews. So it's important to recognize that citizen science is just another brand of science, and you can remind any of the critics of that. And I have a lot of people to thank. If it'll go to the acknowledgement slide, I don't know. But many people in this room have collaborated on different stages of what I presented. So thank you for your efforts. And I cited different studies, and I have a slide with those references if anyone wants to look them up.
All right.
That's it. We have time for questions?
All right. Well, we're
There we
right
go.
there. Maybe we could take one, and then if there's another question, we could take a second question while the next panel is kind of getting set up.
Yeah, our next panel is on data quality, so you can keep questions going. Vince.
So, when it comes to the error that what you showed before, as far as what is error, you think there might be an inherent difference between data that in essence is, ends up as yes, no, like, is this a red maple? And things like, what is the DBH, where, it's almost infinite how many, depending on your accuracy, it's almost infinite how many measurements you could get for that. I mean, just because of what is the true answer to what the DBH is.
Well, and the same thing could be said for species, though. There's like an infinite number of species that it could be, and one of the issues that Jason, Henny, and I were the ones collaborating to collect the expert level data in Philadelphia, we kept coming across Acer X Freemanii, a hybrid species of maple that's very close to red maple. And we were writing it down as Acer SP because we were going, well, we think it's Freemanii, but we really should double check. Most of the crews wrote it down as rubrum, as Acer rubrum. But at the end of the day, who really cares if it's Acer Freemanii, right? So it's partly, that could have, some managers might care, but for that particular hybrid, it's not that big a deal. And so recognizing that there's a huge array of species that could be there at this one site, but if what we really want to know about is like, where are the ash, because they're going to get killed soon by emerald ash borer, and we just make sure the volunteers are well trained on that topic, and we accept that maybe some of the less common species are going to be messed up with their species ID, then maybe we're okay with that as a result. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up so that I can turn it over to the panel, but thank you all for listening.